Silence was not an absence aboard the Nicor. It was a presence, thick and heavy as the void beyond its adamantium skin. It was the silence of the deep ocean trench, of the predator holding its breath before the lunge. On the command bridge, that silence was a mantle worn by its master, Captain Tyberos of the Carcharodons Astra. He stood before the main viewing port, a monolith of gray ceramite and cold resolve, his gaze fixed on the infinite black. Stars were not points of light here, but distant, cold pinpricks swallowed by an abyss so profound it seemed to swallow thought itself. Around him his battle brothers moved in the dim, red-lit gloom, their rituals a form of wordless prayer. One, his armor scarred from 100 forgotten engagements, drew a whetstone along the chain teeth of his combat blade. The sound was a soft, grating rasp, rhythmic as a heartbeat, each stroke a promise of violence to come. Another knelt, using the tip of a knife to inscribe minute sigils onto a fragment of bleached bone, oaths of exile, of endurance, of the hunt. The bone was human, or perhaps something older. None asked and none would tell. The air carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone and oil, and beneath it the older, subtler smell of salt and cold stone. The Nicor did not sail so much as it drifted, its engines a low, subaudible thrum felt in the marrow rather than heard. It was a leviathan of the outer dark, a shark of ancient design, its hull pitted by micro-impacts and stained by the strange residues of the void. It waited. This was its natural state, this patient, hungry stillness in the gulfs between galaxies, in the spaces the light of the Imperium had never truly touched. Tyberos's eyes, hidden behind the red lenses of his Terminator helm, saw more than the void. He saw the legacy of their isolation. The bridge was not adorned with imperial aquilas or saintly icons. Instead, faded murals depicted vast, nebulous sea beasts from lost terra and trophies hung from chains, serrated carapaces from unknown xeno, skulls with too many eye sockets, fragments of armor from foes whose very names were dust. They were relics of a nomadic existence that stretched back millennia, a history written in scars and silence. Here, in the eerie peace of the absolute deep, the cursed existence of the chapter was most palpable. They were cut off, not just in distance but in spirit. No astropathic choirs sang their praises. No forge worlds eagerly resupplied them. They were self-contained, a closed ecosystem of war and survival, forever orbiting the bright, noisy civilization they were sworn to protect yet could never rejoin. The silence was their companion, their prison, and their armor. It bred a kind of focused emptiness in the soul, a void within to match the void without, ready to be filled only by the roar of combat and the shedding of blood. The Nicor held its breath, a phantom in the night, and its master watched the dark, knowing that from such profound stillness, only the most absolute violence could be born. The silence shattered. It was not a sound, but a psychic rupture, a jagged spike of pure terror and pain that tore through the Nicor's insulated calm like a harpoon. Every lumen on the bridge flickered, plunging the chamber into a strobing, crimson twilight. The battle brothers froze, their rituals interrupted, heads turning as one toward the source, the sealed vault of the astropathic relay. From within that warded chamber, insulated by layers of psychoconductive crystal and lead, a scream reverberated through the mind rather than the air. It was a distorted, agonized thing, the death cry of a soul stretched across light years, carrying with it the final, fragmented impression of a world dying. Tyberos did not flinch. He turned from the viewing port, his massive form a study in controlled reaction. The psychic backwash washed over him, a tide of alien hunger and human despair, and was met with a will of cold iron. His armored fingers, each tipped with dormant lightning claws, flexed once. The scream faded, guttering into a psychic echo that hung in the air like the smell of ozone after a storm. In its wake, a message remained, etched into the ship's spirit and the minds of those attuned. A string of coordinates, a galactic cartograph sigil for an agri world named Sargassa, and the overriding instinctual glyph for consumption, the mark of the great devourer, the Tyranids. On the command dais, a hololith sputtered to life, painting the air in sickly green and amber. It resolved into a grainy, static-riddled image, a world of once verdant landmasses now bleeding a virulent, crawling green, as if infected moss were consuming a corpse. Continental shapes were obscured beneath a chitinous tide. The silent, screaming data stream told the rest: orbital defenses gone, population signals dwindling into nothingness. The distinctive biosignature of a hive fleet tendril designated minor but voracious, in the final stages of consumption. A summons, not from the Imperium's high command, for the Carcharodons Astra received no such dignities. This was a scream into the dark, a pulse of existential dread that had, by ancient design or cruel fate, found the one predator lurking in this particular stretch of night. In the vault of Tyberos's memory, older than the ship around him, older than many of the stars outside, an oath stirred. It was not written on parchment, but etched into the gene code of his chapter, a deep, resonant imperative that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the hunter's heart. It was the pact, the ancient and terrible covenant that bound them to the outer dark. Its terms were simple, brutal, and absolute. When the enemies of humanity threatened from the void's edge, the exiles would answer. No matter the distance, no hope of reinforcement, no promise of glory or remembrance. They were the answer to the desperate cry in the night, the teeth that met the encroaching shadow. Sargassa was screaming. The oath demanded blood. Tyberos's voice, when it emerged from his helm's vox grill, was a low, grinding bass that vibrated in the deck plates. It was not a shout, but a command that carried the weight of glaciers moving. Navigation. Plot a course for the provided coordinates. Maximum sustainable translation velocity. Across the bridge, servitors twitched into frenzied activity, clattering at brass consoles. The navigator, ensconced in his shielded spire, would already be feeling the psychic ripples of the hive mind, steeling himself for the plunge. Tyberos turned his gaze upon his brothers. Their eyes, behind their own lenses, glinted with a reflected hunger. The long vigil was over. The stillness had been a coiled spring, and now it was released. "Summon the company," he intoned. "All hands to war stations. The void has spoken. A world drowns in the swarm. We are the answer." He did not speak of salvation, for that was not their purpose. He spoke of an answer, a violent, terminal response. As the Nicor's ancient engines began to build from a thrum to a deep, awakening roar, power flooding its systems, Tyberos looked once more at the bleeding world on the hololith. The eerie peace was gone, burned away by the astropathic scream. In its place was the cold, clear focus of the shark that has scented blood across miles of empty ocean. The course was set. They would move through the outer dark, a gray specter of vengeance, bound by an oath no living man remembered making, heading straight for the heart of the devouring green. The arming chambers of the Nicor were not halls of glory, but ossuaries of purpose. Here, in the deep, resonant belly of the ship, the silence of the void was replaced by the ritual sounds of preparation. The hiss of pneumatics, the click of ceramite plates locking into place, the low chant of machine spirits being roused from slumber. The air was cold and carried the sharp, clean scents of ozone, sacred oils, and the faint, iron-like odor of long-dried blood ingrained into the stone floor. Kale stood before his arming rack, a new-made initiate, his enhanced frame still feeling unfamiliar beneath the touch of the gray armor being fitted to him by silent surf attendants. Each piece was a masterpiece of forbidding artistry, its surface the color of a deep-sea storm. Etched into the shoulder guard, The greave, the breastplate, was the same recurring motif, the shark. Not the heraldic symbol of a noble house, but the essence of the predator itself, a streamlined, merciless shape, all serrated jaw and dead black eye. The etchings were not decorative, they were reminders, a visual mantra of what they were and what they must become. As the final chest plate was sealed with a deep thunk, Cale felt the weight settle upon him. It was not just the physical mass of plasteel and ceramite, but the heavier, immaterial burden of lineage. This armor had been worn by others before him, brothers lost to the void or consumed in the red work of battle. Their deeds, their silence, their hungers were baked into its very structure. He flexed his fingers within his gauntlets, the neural interface flickering to life, painting targeting data and biometrics across his retinal display in faint, green glyphs. He was now a part of the machine, a component of the chapter's relentless engine. A change in the chamber's atmosphere drew his attention. The methodical clatter ceased as veteran Sergeant Surjax entered. He was a walking monument to violence, his armor a tapestry of scars and repaired battle damage, adorned with trophies that clinked softly with each step, fangs of unknown beasts, finger bones on chains, a shard of crystalline carapace that still seemed to writhe. He moved to the center of the chamber, and every initiate, Cale included, turned to face him, standing at rigid attention. Surjax did not speak in Gothic. Instead, he began a low, guttural chant, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to rise from the deck plates themselves. The language was dead, a tongue from lost Terra or perhaps something far older and more terrible, all hard consonants and sibilant hisses. It was the litany of predation. The words spoke of deep currents, of cold blood, of the ambush from the black, of the frenzy of the feeding. They were not words of courage or honor, but of efficiency and absolute, ruthless consumption. As the chant rolled on, the initiates joined in, their voices a hesitant chorus at first, then gaining strength, merging with Surjax's until the chamber vibrated with the sound. Cale felt the syllables on his tongue, alien and sharp. He did not understand their meaning intellectually, but in his marrow their intent was clear. They bypassed reason and spoke directly to the primal, engineered killer within him. A thrill, cold and sharp as a razor, coursed through his enhanced system, a biochemical echo of the hunt, the promise of violence, the purity of purpose. But intertwined with that thrill was a deep, anchoring dread. As the chant echoed off the stark walls, Cale looked at the veteran brothers assisting with final armaments. Their movements were economical, devoid of wasted motion or emotion. Their eyes, when glimpsed behind their helms, were not fired with zeal, but were flat, depthless pools. This ritual, this life, was not a path to glory. It was an inheritance of a curse. They were being forged into weapons, yes, but weapons that would forever be wielded in the dark, unseen and unthanked. Their very existence a grim necessity to be hidden from the light of the Imperium they served. The chant reached a crescendo and ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that felt charged and hungry. Surjax swept his gaze across the ranks of gray-armored warriors. He gave no inspiring speech, offered no promise of redemption. He simply gave a single, slow nod, the gesture heavy with the weight of merciless tradition. The moment of preparation was over. The ritual had sealed their intent. Cale took up his bolt gun, its surface cool and familiar, and fell into line with his squad. The primal thrill still hummed in his veins, a siren call to battle, but it was now framed by the sobering understanding of what it truly meant to wear the gray. They were not knights. They were sharks, and the ocean ahead was full of blood. They filed out of the arming chamber, not to fanfare, but into the echoing, dimly lit corridors that led to the drop pod bays, each step a further commitment to the cursed, endless hunt that now defined his life. The translation into the warp was not a roar, but a sigh, a long, whispering exhalation as reality itself tore like rotten silk. The Nicor slid into the Empyrean, and the star-studded black of the void was replaced by a swirling, impossible panorama of bruised purples, sickly greens, and pulsating veins of non-light. Yet, where most vessels would be buffeted by psychic tempests and assailed by the whispers of demons, the Nicor's passage was unnervingly calm. The ship cut through the immaterial tides like a blade through still water, its gellar field a faint, steady hum rather than a screaming bulwark. This silence within the storm was more disturbing than any turbulence. It felt like being watched, like the warp itself was holding its breath in recognition of an old and dreaded guest. In the ship's central sanctum, a chamber lined with psychic wards carved from the bones of void whales, Librarian Arcturus stood vigil. His blue armor was a stark contrast to the chapter's gray, but it was just as worn, just as scarred. His hands moved in precise, intricate patterns, weaving strands of protective energy that shimmered like heat haze around the ship's psychic core. His lips moved, but the words that emerged from his helm's grill were not the noble cant of the Imperial Creed. They were low, guttural incantations, a stream of phonemes that clawed at the air. They sounded less like prayers and more like curses, ancient, potent threats hissed into the face of the Empyrean, commands for the things that slithered in the deep to stay back. Each syllable was weighted with a tangible menace, a promise of reciprocal annihilation that seemed to cow the chaotic energies around them. To hear it was to understand that the Carcharodons' protection was not born of faith in the divine, but of a deeper, darker familiarity with what lay beyond. The ship's interior, usually a place of stark utility, took on a more profound strangeness in the warp light that seeped through viewports. The lumens cast long, dancing shadows that made the trophies adorning the halls seem to twitch and sway. Xeno's skulls, their shapes blasphemous and geometries all wrong, hung from blackened chains, their hollow sockets catching the unreal colors. Faded murals, painted millennia ago by hands that remembered Terra's oceans, depicted vast leviathans locked in eternal hunts in sunless deeps. The scenes were of motion and violence, yet here in the timeless warp they felt static, like insects trapped in amber, a fossilized memory of a predatory nature that had never changed. The corridors felt less like parts of a starship and more like the gullet of some immense, ancient beast, digesting its own history as it swam through an endless, hungry sea. Alone in his stratagem, Captain Tyberos meditated. He had removed his massive Terminator helm, revealing a face that was less flesh and more a topography of scars and grim endurance, his eyes like chips of flint in a granite cliff. Before him, on a simple stone plinth, lay the chapter's sole article of imperial regalia, a tattered, fraying standard so ancient its original colors were indistinguishable. It was a ghost of allegiance, a whisper of a connection long severed. His thoughts were not on the coming battle but on the journey itself, the endless journey. This was their existence, a perpetual navigation of the abyss, both the physical void between stars and the metaphysical void of their purpose. They were nomads of the absolute dark, forever cutting through the silent, hungry spaces. They were cut off not just by distance but by essence. The heart of the Imperium, the bustling hive worlds, the devout shrine planets, the triumphant marches of other chapters, was a fever dream, a distant rumor of a light too bright to look upon. Theirs was the reality of the fringe, the cold and the quiet and the things that gnawed at the edges of reality. This isolation had forged them into something otherworldly. They did not fight for the glory of the Emperor in a way a citizen would understand. They fought because it was the only function left to them, the sole reason for their cursed existence. The warp's unnatural calm around his ship seemed to affirm this. They did not belong to the realm of order, nor were they consumed by chaos. They were something in between, a force of nature as grim and inevitable as the tide, forever orbiting a sun they could never feel, their loyalty a silent, bloody thing known only to the void and the dying. The Nicor sailed on, a phantom in a sea of phantoms, carrying within its iron heart the last hunters of a forgotten age. The warp released its hold with a soundless, psychic shudder. The swirling madness of the Empyrean bled away, replaced once more by the stark, star-dusted black of real space. Before the Nicor's main viewing port, Sargassa hung like a poisoned fruit in the void. It was a world in its death throes, where there should have been the blues of oceans and the browns and greens of cultivated land. A virulent, pulsating green now spread across the continents, a living, crawling infection. It was the color of necrosis, of gangrene on a planetary scale. Vast, organic tendrils, visible even from high orbit, coiled around the landmasses like the roots of some monstrous weed, pulsing with vile nutrients siphoned from a dying biosphere. The Tyranid hive fleet's consumption was not a battle. It was a digestion, nearly complete. On the bridge, the silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was the quiet of a predator assessing its prey, calculating the angle of its lunge. The lumens remained dim, casting the chamber in a blood-watch glow. Captain Tyberos studied the hololith feed, his immense form a statue of cold appraisal. The data streams were grim. Orbital debris, the shattered remains of defense monitors and bulk freighters, drifted in a loose ring around the world. No Imperial signals pierced the static. The only energy signatures were the relentless, hungry biopulses of the swarm below and the fading thermal ghosts of cities burned out from within. The agri-world was a corpse, its veins tapped dry, but the Xeno's infestation still twitched upon it, scouring the bones. Tyberos's order, when it came, was a vox click, a binary command sent directly to the ship's command cortex. No clarion call, no rousing speech echoed through the decks. Silent running. Across the Nicor, systems powered down to a ghostly minimum. The deep thrum of the engines faded to a whisper, then to nothing. External vox beads retracted. Auspex arrays switched to passive listening only. No navigation flares ignited, no thruster burns corrected their approach. The great battleship became a shadow, a jagged piece of stellar drift, its gray hull absorbing the faint light of the system's distant sun. It was a reversion to their most primal state, the ambush predator from the dark. In the launch bays, activity was a study in controlled, wordless urgency. Under the dull red emergency lighting, ranks of drop pods stood like sinister eggs in an iron nest. Tech adepts and armored serfs moved with ritualistic precision, checking final seals, loading auxiliary munitions racks, and anointing the pods, blunt noses with sacred unguents that smelled of cold salt and iron. Within each pod, a squad of Carcharodons stood locked in their restraint harnesses, their gray armor, part of the pod's interior gloom. There was no chatter over the vox, no last-minute encouragements, only the sound of regulated breathing and the soft click of safeties being thumbed off. Kale felt the pod shudder as its launch mag clamps engaged. Through a narrow, reinforced view slit, he watched the bay doors yawn open below him, revealing the terrifying panorama of Sargassa swelling to fill the darkness. The crawling green was even more hideous up close, a tapestry of vile vitality. He saw flashes of movement, vast, winged shapes skimming the upper atmosphere, the distant, lightning-like flicker of bioplasma discharges. The world was alive with the enemy, utterly unaware of the specter in its sky. With a series of deep, resonant thuds that vibrated through the ship's skeleton, the drop pods were ejected. No thrusters fired initially. They fell, sleek and black, relying on the planet's gravity to pull them down, their heat shields cold. They were not fiery comets heralding salvation. They were stones dropped into a murky pond, meant to sink before the ripples spread. Only in the upper atmosphere did retrojets cough to life, brief and controlled, just enough to adjust their trajectories and ensure they fell not as a clustered beacon, but as a scattered rain of silent, deadly hail. The descent was a roaring, shaking nightmare of pressure and heat, the pod groaning as it bit into the atmospheric blanket. Kale's auto senses dampened the worst of the noise, leaving him in a cocoon of amplified biometrics and the pounding of his own hearts. Through the view slit, the sky turned from black to a sickly, green-tinged orange, streaked with the contrails of other pods, their signatures minimal, their emissions scrubbed. They fell through banks of strange, chitinous spores that pattered against the hull like acidic rain. They descended past drifting, jellyfish-like bioforms that pulsed with internal light, oblivious to the killers slicing through their domain. The pods. Arrival was not announced by thunderous impacts, but by a series of deep, muffled crunches as they buried themselves in the soft, corrupted soil of Sargas's dying continents, in the shadow of fungal forests and the ruins of granary silos. Hatches blew open not with pyrotechnic fury, but with the sharp, efficient hiss of hydraulic pistons. In the sudden, oppressive humidity, thick with the scent of rotting biomass and alien pheromones, the Carcharodons emerged. They came out not with bellows, but in a crouch, bolt guns sweeping across terrain that writhed with minor bioforms. They moved from cover to cover with a fluid, predatory grace, their gray armor already streaked with mud and sap. There were no flares to mark their landing zone, no vox calls to coordinate with a command ship. They simply appeared as if birthed from the planet's own misery, a sudden, localized metastasis of absolute violence where moments before there had been only the mindless consumption of the swarm. Their arrival was a secret held between the killers and their prey, a secret that would only be discovered when the first bioform fell, its death scream a silent ripple in the hive mind's consciousness. Already too late. The sharks had entered the water, and the feeding frenzy was about to begin. The world erupted in a frenzy of chitin and gunfire. Kale's drop pod had buried itself in a field of spongy, violet fungus that released a cloud of choking spores upon impact. The hatch blew open and he was moving before the mist cleared, his boots sinking into the soft, giving earth. The sound hit him first, a chittering, clicking cacophony that vibrated in his teeth, the sound of a billion mandibles scraping together, of claws on stone, of wet flesh tearing. It was the voice of the swarm, a mindless, hungry static that filled the air thicker than the spore clouds. Then came the smell, a cloying, sweet-rot stench of digested biomass and alien pheromones, so potent it bypassed his helm's filters and seemed to coat the back of his throat. He saw them, not as individual creatures but as a living tide. A river of gaunts flowed around the fungal stalks, their carapaces glistening with slime, their lidless eyes fixed on some distant imperative. Larger forms moved behind them, hulking warriors with scything talons, their bony crests piercing the low-hanging, toxic fog. The sky was a kaleidoscope of winged gargoyles and floating, spore-dripping mycetic spores. Sargassa was not a battlefield. It was a digestion tract, and he had landed in its stomach. His training, drilled into him by Surjax in the echoing halls of the Nicor, overrode the primal fear that threatened to freeze his enhanced limbs. Fear was a luxury. Analysis was a tool. His auto-senses painted targeting reticules across his retinal display, highlighting priority threats, calculating fire lanes. His body moved without conscious command. He brought his bolt gun to his shoulder, the stock settling against his pauldron with a familiar, solid thunk. The world narrowed to the view down its barrel. He fired. The roar of the bolt gun was a shocking, physical thing in the biosphere's din. The first round took a gaunt in the center of its torso, and the mass-reactive shell detonated a microsecond later. Chitin, flesh, and acidic blood erupted in a wet spray, painting the fungus behind it a violent purple. The creature ceased to be a part of the tide and became mere debris. Kale shifted his aim, the servos in his armor whining softly. Another shot, another explosion of alien matter. He was sweeping the gun in short, controlled bursts now, each roar of the weapon punctuating the swarm's chittering symphony. Gaunts fell, torn apart, but for every one that disintegrated, 3 more clambered over their twitching remains, driven by a single, collective hunger. He was not alone. To his left and right, the gray shapes of his squadmates emerged from their own pods, adding their fire to the storm. Boltround streaked through the mist, stitching lines of destruction through the advancing tide. A warrior, its talons raised high, was hammered by a concentrated volley, its carapace cracking like ceramic before it collapsed, its limbs still twitching. But the swarm did not falter. It had no concept of fear, only consumption. It flowed around obstacles, over the dead, a wave of claws and teeth that sought to drown them in sheer, mindless numbers. Then a new sound cut through the din, a sound like the sky itself tearing. It was the shriek of lightning claws igniting, a crackling, ozone-burning snarl that spoke of ancient, terrible power. From a pod that had impacted like a meteorite, carving a furrow through the fungal field, a figure rose. Captain Tyberos emerged from the wreckage not as a man, but as an avatar of annihilation. He stood a full head taller than the warriors around him, his Terminator armor a fortress of gray dread. Upon his fists, the massive lightning claws crackled with barely contained energy, casting a flickering blue-white light over the chitinous horde. He did not run. He walked into the swarm, a glacier of ceramite and death. A knot of hormagaunts, faster than their brethren, leapt at him, their talons extended. Tyberos's left arm moved in a blur. The lightning claws swept out, and where they passed, the creatures simply ceased to exist. They did not fall in pieces. They vaporized in puffs of superheated chitin and steam, their biological matter flash-carbonized. A warrior, more massive than a dreadnought, charged him, its bone sword swinging. Tyberos met the charge. He stepped inside the swinging blades, his own claws coming up in a crosswise shear. There was a shriek of sundered bioarmor and a spray of viscous green ichor. The warrior was cleft into 3 smoking segments that thudded wetly to the ground. He waded deeper, each step methodical, each swing of his claws a study in brutal efficiency. He did not fight with flourish or rage, but with a chilling, surgical precision. He targeted joint, nerve cluster, and brainstem, dismantling the larger bioforms with an economy of motion that was more terrifying than any berserk fury. The swarm, for the first time, seemed to hesitate around him, the hive mind's local consciousness recoiling from this sudden, absolute negation of its forms. Tyberos became the eye of a storm of gore, a zone of pure, unanswerable violence where the great devourer's children were not just killed, but unmade. Kale, firing relentlessly to keep the Gaunts from his own position, watched the captain work. It was not inspiration he felt, but a deep, humbling awe that bordered on dread. This was the pinnacle of what they were, the ultimate expression of their predatory purpose. It was warfare stripped of all pretense, reduced to its most elemental state, the application of overwhelming force to rend and tear until nothing moved. The frenzy of the swarm met the colder, sharper frenzy of the shark, and in that meeting on the rotting soil of Sargassa, the first blood of the campaign was not just spilled, it was atomized. The initial, chaotic violence crystallized into a grim, controlled purge. The scattered pods had formed a ragged, defensible perimeter around a low rise of bedrock that pierced the fungal plain. The Carcharodons fought with a synchronicity that spoke of centuries of shared butchery, each squad a self-contained engine of death. They funneled the Tyranid tide into killing zones, where overlapping fields of bolt gun fire shredded flesh and chitin into a foul mulch. Heavy flamers coughed gouts of promethium, setting the spongy ground and the creatures upon it alight, filling the air with the stench of burning alien meat and a greasy, black smoke. Kale, his armor now streaked with ichor and soot, moved with his battle brothers in a practiced leapfrog advance, securing the flanks of their nascent landing zone. His world had narrowed to the cycle of aim, fire, and advance, the roar of his weapon, a constant percussion in his ears. It was during a momentary lull as his squad paused to reload that he saw it. From the densest knot of the swarm, where the bioforms were larger and the psychic pressure was a tangible fog, a new horror emerged. It was a hive tyrant, a towering monument of the hive mind's will. Its wings, vast and veined, beat the toxic air with slow, powerful strokes, sending gusts of decay across the field. One limb ended in a massive bone sword, the other in a writhing, whip-like lash of living tissue that crackled with biolightning. Its crest flared, emitting a psychic screech that made Kale's teeth ache and caused the lesser creatures around it to shudder in ecstatic submission. The creature landed with a ground-shaking impact, its gaze sweeping over the gray warriors. It focused on the largest source of disruption, the storm of lightning claws at the center of the carnage. With a guttural, hydraulic roar that cut through the battle's din, it charged Tyberos. The captain did not retreat. He turned to meet the challenge, his claws casting long, jagged shadows. The hive tyrant struck first, the bone sword descending in a blow that could split a tank. Tyberos caught it on the crossed blades of his lightning claws. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and the shriek of energy meeting hyperdense bone was deafening. Biolightning lashed out from the tyrant's other limb, arcing over Tyberos's armor, leaving scorch marks on the gray ceramite but failing to find purchase. The two titans strained against each other, a contest of absolute physical power. Then Tyberos moved. He disengaged with a twist that was impossibly fast for his bulk, letting the bone sword slam into the earth beside him. In the same motion he pivoted, his right claw coming up in a savage upward arc. The energized talons met the tyrant's neck where the chitinous plating met a softer, pulsating underflesh. There was a flash of blinding white light, a sound like a thunderclap contained in a small space, and the smell of ozone and cooked organs. The hive tyrant's charge faltered. Its massive body went rigid. The psychic presence that had surrounded it like a pressure dome snapped out of existence, leaving a sudden, silent vacuum. Then slowly the great head, severed cleanly from the shoulders, toppled sideways and hit the ground with a wet, final thud. The headless body remained standing for a second longer before its knees buckled and it collapsed, a mountain of useless meat. The effect on the swarm was instantaneous and chaotic. The lesser creatures, their synaptic link to the guiding intelligence severed, stumbled, their coordinated assault dissolving into mindless, individual twitches and snaps. The Carcharodons pressed the advantage, their fire becoming even more methodical, more slaughterhouse-efficient. Tyberos stood over his felled foe. He deactivated the lightning claw on his right hand, the energy field vanishing with a dying crackle. Then, with a grip of terrible finality, he reached down, his massive fingers closing around a horn-like protrusion on the tyrant's severed head. With a wrenching pull, he tore the trophy free from the remaining strands of gristle and nerve cord. He held the head aloft, a grotesque prize the size of a man's torso, ichor dripping in thick ropes from the cauterized stump. He did not roar in triumph. He simply turned, the head held high for a moment, a silent, brutal proclamation to his brothers and the reeling swarm, before hooking it to a chain at his belt where it swung, a macabre pendulum. The battle brothers saw the act and fought on, their movements never faltering. They flowed around the fallen bioforms, executing the disoriented creatures with pitiless efficiency. They moved as a pack, their tactics a blend of transhuman skill and something far more primal, a coordinated brutality that was beautiful and horrifying in its perfection. They communicated with sharp hand signs and prepositional understanding, flanking, encircling, and exterminating with no wasted motion. But Kale, as he fired at a stumbling warrior, found his gaze drawn not to their tactics but to their eyes. Through the visors of nearby brothers in the fleeting moments when the battle's light caught them just so, he saw it. There was no fervor there, no righteous anger, not even the cold satisfaction of duty done. Their eyes were empty, and deep within that emptiness something else glimmered, a hunger. It was the same flat, depthless hunger he had seen in the arming chambers, but now it was fed and yet unsated. It was the look of the shark after the first bite, not turning away but circling for more. A cold knot tightened in Kale's gut, separate from the adrenaline of combat. These were his brothers, the pinnacle of what he was to become. They were saving this world in their own merciless fashion. Yet, as he watched them move through the carnage, their gray armor slick with alien life, their eyes hollow and yearning, a treacherous thought wormed its way into his mind. The line between humanity and the monstrosity they fought seemed terrifyingly thin, blurred by the same ichor that stained them all. They were culling the swarm, yes, but in their silent, hungry efficiency, in the way their captain took a head as casually as another man might pick a stone. He wondered if they were not simply a different kind of monster, honed by forgotten oaths to perform a grim, eternal surgery on a galaxy they were no longer a part of. The landing zone was secure. The first blood was theirs. But as the silence began to return, broken only by the hiss of burning fungus and the last spasms of dying xenos, Kale felt less like a savior and more like a participant in a feeding frenzy, where the distinction between predator and prey was the only morality that remained. The silence after the storm of battle was a living thing, thick and cloying. It was not an absence of sound, but a composition of quieter, more intimate horrors, the wet, settling sigh of eviscerated bioforms, the slow drip of ichor from shattered carapaces, the hiss of promethium fires consuming the last of the fungal stalks. The air, still heavy with the stench of alien death and burnt biomass, seemed to pulse with the fading echo of violence. In this grim lull, the Carcharodons did not rest. They began another kind of work, one as ritualized and essential as the combat that had preceded it. Across the secured perimeter, the gray-armored figures moved among the heaps of Tyranid dead. They did so not with the hurried efficiency of scavengers, but with the deliberate, reverent care of priests performing a sacrament. Bolt guns were slung, and in their stead came knives, long serrated blades of blackened steel, their edges etched with the same shark-tooth patterns that adorned their armor. The warriors knelt in the muck, their massive forms made strangely humble by the act. Kale watched as veteran Sergeant Surjax approached a fallen warrior, its scything talons still twitching with residual nerve impulses. Surjax placed a boot upon the creature's thorax, pinning it, and then drove his knife into the joint of its massive, bone-crusted jaw. There was a wet, cracking sound as he worked the blade with precise, leveraging motions. With a final, grating pull, he extracted a tooth, a curved, serrated fang as long as a man's forearm, its surface a glossy black streaked with internal fluids. He held it up, examining it in the sickly light filtering through the spore clouds. Then, from a pouch at his belt, he produced a length of fibrous cord, woven from the sinews of some unknown beast, and began to thread the tooth onto it, alongside other, older trophies that clacked softly together. All around him, brothers performed the same rite. They carved not from the flesh, which was already beginning to liquefy into nutrient sludge, but from the enduring chitin and bone. Fangs from hormagaunts, razor-sharp spurs from warrior limbs, Even the needle-like teeth from the smaller, skittering creatures, all were harvested. The air filled with the sounds of scraping, cracking, and the soft rasp of cord being drawn through newly drilled holes. It was a systematic harvest, a grim reaping following the slaughter. Surjax finished stringing the warrior's fang and turned, his gaze falling upon Kale, who stood observing, his own hands empty. The veteran's helm tilted in a silent command. Kale approached, the soft ground sucking at his boots. Surjax gestured to a nearby gaunt, its body relatively intact. He did not speak, but the expectation was as clear as a shouted order. Kale drew his own combat knife. The grip was familiar, but the act felt profoundly alien. He knelt beside the dead creature, its compound eyes staring blankly at the toxic sky. Its mouth was a nightmare of needle teeth. Up close, the Tyranid stench was overwhelming, a mix of ammonia and spoiled meat. His hands, which had been steady and sure when holding a bolt gun, trembled slightly. This was not the hot, reactive violence of battle. This was cold, intimate violation. It felt less like claiming a trophy and more like performing an autopsy on something that had never been truly alive. He found a gap in the chitinous lip plates, inserted the tip of his blade, and levered. A tooth, slick and sharp, popped free with a faint snick. He caught it before it could fall into the muck. It was small, no longer than his thumb, but it was perfectly formed, a tool designed for nothing but tearing. He looked from the tooth in his palm to the gaunt's vacant face, and a wave of profound dissonance washed over him. He had just killed dozens of these creatures, yet this small, deliberate act felt heavier. As if sensing his hesitation, Surjax's Vox grill emitted a low, static-laden hum. He tapped a gauntleted finger against the necklace of trophies hanging against his own chest plate. The gesture was followed by words, spoken in that same dead, guttural tongue from the arming ritual, but now translated by Kale's auto-senses into blunt, functional Gothic. Each trophy honors the nature of the predator, Surjax intoned, his voice devoid of pride or passion, merely stating a fact as immutable as gravity. It is a remembrance of the hunt, a weight to carry. It reminds us that we do not kill for glory or for hatred. We kill because it is our function. We take from the kill to remember the function. The tooth of the prey becomes the talisman of the hunter. It is the cycle. Kale looked at the necklace. The trophies were not polished or adorned. They were raw, stained, some still bearing minute flecks of dried ichor or old blood. They were not symbols of victory, but mnemonics of violence. Each one represented a moment of consumption, a link in an endless chain of predation that stretched back into the chapter's shrouded past. To wear them was to carry the weight of that tradition, to accept one's role in that eternal bloody cycle. His hands stilled. The trembling ceased, replaced by a cold resolve that seeped into the spaces where his doubt had been. He understood now. This was not about desecration. It was about integration. They were not just killing the swarm, they were absorbing a part of its essence, its predatory purpose, and making it their own. They were asserting through this quiet, eerie ritual that they were the superior hunters, the ultimate predators in any ecosystem they entered. He took the cord Surjax offered him, a short, unadorned length of the same dark sinew. With deliberate movements, he drilled a small hole through the base of the gaunt's tooth with the tip of his knife, then threaded it onto the cord. He tied the ends together and slipped the loop over his head, the small tooth coming to rest against the gray ceramite of his chest plate. It was a negligible physical weight, but it felt immense. It was his first conscious step into the eerie rituals that defined them, a tangible acceptance of the cursed, predatory life that was now his. Around him, the ritual continued. The brothers worked in silence, their movements rhythmic and focused. The field of the dead was slowly being denuded of its most distinctive parts, the teeth and claws collected, the carcasses left to rot into the soil they had come to consume. Soon, each warrior bore new talismans, strings of dark fangs that clacked softly against their armor as they moved. They stood, their harvest complete, and without a word began to reform their squads, their eyes, still empty, still hungry, scanning the horizon for the next threat. The ritual was over. The hunt, Cale knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core, was never over. It merely paused, allowing for the necessary rites before the next plunge into the red, feeding dark. The command post was a cavern of shadows, carved from the shell of a shattered imperial bastion on the edge of the fungal plain. The air inside was cooler, still tainted by the planetary rot, but carrying the older, drier scents of stone dust and ozone from the Carcharodons' equipment. Flickering lumen strips, powered by a portable generator, cast a stark, unforgiving light over the gathered officers. They stood in a loose semicircle around Captain Tyberos, their gray armor still streaked with the filth of battle, new Tyranid trophies clinking softly against their chest plates with every slight movement. Cale, as part of Sergeant Surjax's squad, stood at the periphery, a silent witness. This was not a briefing for the rank and file. It was a conclave of the chapter's ancient heart, and the atmosphere was thick with a gravity that had nothing to do with the planet's pull. Tyberos stood before a makeshift table, a slab of plasteel laid across two broken pillars. Upon it rested no tactical hololith, no detailed surveyor readouts. Instead, there lay only two objects: the massive, severed head of the hive tyrant, its features already beginning to desiccate in the dry air, and a single, unadorned piece of gray stone, roughly oval, its surface smoothed by millennia of handling. The stone seemed to absorb the light, a deeper darkness in the dim room. The captain did not speak of immediate tactics or swarm dispositions. He stood in silence for a long moment, his gaze moving from face to helmeted face, as if weighing the souls within the ceramite. When his voice finally emerged, it was lower, softer than his battlefield roar, yet it carried through the chamber with the resonance of something dredged from a deep-sea trench. "We answer the call," he began, the words simple, final. "We always answer. This is known. But the why is a ghost in our blood. It is time the ghost was given a shape, however faint." He reached out and placed a massive hand upon the smooth gray stone. His touch was not possessive but ritualistic, as if drawing strength or memory from its inert form. "We were exiled." The word hung in the air, cold and absolute. It was not a confession of shame, but a statement of primordial fact, like the existence of gravity or the void. An age ago, in a time when the Imperium's face was different, our forebears were cast out. The reasons are lost. Perhaps we were too brutal. Perhaps we knew secrets that could not be born in the light. Perhaps we failed a test of loyalty or succeeded in one of atrocity. The chronicles are silent or burned or written in a tongue we have forgotten how to read. All that remains is the consequence. He lifted his hand from the stone, his fingers curling into a fist. "We were sworn to patrol the outer dark, the spaces between the light of civilized stars, sworn to cull the enemies that fester there, the Xenos, the mutant, the heretic, before their shadows could fall upon the Imperium's heart. Ours is a war of prevention, fought in the antechambers of oblivion. We are the unseen scalpel, cutting away the infection before the body ever feels the fever." His gaze swept over them, and Cale felt the weight of that gaze as if it were a physical pressure. There is no glory in this duty, no reward, no parades on Terra, no fealty from grateful worlds. Our victories are erased from history, our sacrifices unknown. The Imperium we protect sleeps soundly in its ignorance, and it must remain so. To be remembered by it is to have failed our oath. We are the price paid for its peace, a price forever hidden in the ledger. He paused, and the silence deepened, filled with the unsaid horror of it. An eternity of warfare without end, without recognition, without the solace of a greater purpose beyond the grim mechanics of the kill. It was a curse woven into the very fabric of their being. "This oath," Tyberos ground out, the word tasting of ash, "is our curse. It is the chain that binds us to the void, the hunger that can never be sated. It is the reason our eyes are empty and our souls are cold. It is also our only purpose. Without it we are nothing but ghosts in gray armor, drifting without a star to steer by. It is the rock upon which our chapter is built, and the millstone around its neck. We are both the hunter and the hunted, forever chasing our own tails in the infinite dark. From the shadows near the wall, where the light seemed to shy away, librarian Arcturus stirred. His blue armor was a bruise of color in the monochrome gathering. He had been silent, a brooding presence, but now he spoke, his voice a whisper that nonetheless slithered into every ear. The captain speaks truth, but consider this, brothers. An oath requires two parties, one to swear and one to receive the vow. Who received ours? He let the question linger, a serpent coiling in the still air. Some oaths, Arcturus continued, his tone one of scholarly dread, are not bonds of honor, they are chains. They are not sworn on altars but in deep places for reasons of desperation or despair. They are agreements with silence, with the void itself. What did our ancestors bargain for? What terrible price was paid, what service rendered to earn this eternal patrol? The oath is our purpose, yes, but it may also be our prison, and the warden's face is a mystery darker than the void between galaxies. His words did not contradict Tyberos, they deepened the abyss he had outlined. The oath was not just a duty, it was a potential shackle, its origins sunk in a black ocean of forgotten history. Were they loyal servants or bound thralls? Question echoed in the silent chamber, finding no answer in the stern, scarred faces of the officers. Tyberos did not refute the librarian. He gave a slow, heavy nod as if acknowledging a painful, familiar wound. The why is lost. The what remains. Sargassa bleeds. The swarm threatens a sector. The oath, curse, or chain demands we act. That is all we need to know. That is all we can ever know. He straightened, the moment of revelation passing, sealed away once more behind the mask of command. He turned his attention to the tyrant's head on the table. Our history is a ghost, he concluded, his voice returning to its usual commanding bass. But our enemies are flesh, and flesh can be cut. The oath is the wind at our backs. Now we plan how to steer by it. Surjax, report on the scout patrols to the northern spore chimneys. The transition was abrupt, the haunting mystery of their existence shoved back into the dark to make room for the immediate, brutal practicality of war. The officers leaned in, their focus shifting to maps and auspex scans. But the echo of Tyberos's words lingered in the cold air, a psychic stain alongside the smell of decay. Kale stood frozen for a moment longer, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the small gaunt's tooth on his chest. Its weight was different now. It was no longer just a trophy of a hunt, but a tiny link in an immeasurably long chain, a chain of exile, of silent, thankless war, stretching back to a forgotten oath sworn in some unimaginable past. The curse had a name now and a shape. It was the very reason he existed. And as the officers began to speak of flanking maneuvers and synaptic disruption, Kale felt the depth of that dark ocean beneath his feet and understood for the first time that they were all forever drowning in it. The taste of victory was always ash. The Carcharodons had carved a festering wound in the Tyranid swarm, but the planet's death rattle continued, a low, psychic hum felt in the bones. In the grim quiet following the conclave, the war shifted from the open field to the secret, cancerous places. Scout patrols, moving with the silent grace of shadows, had slipped beyond the perimeter into the contorted landscape of spore chimneys and half-digested rock. They returned not with boasts, but with cold, hard data delivered in terse, sign-language reports and grainy picked feeds that painted a new layer of horror over Sargas's corpse. The focus was a settlement, not one of the planets. Major hive cities, which were now vast, ossified mounds of consumed biomass, but a secondary agri-complex, nestled in the lee of a mountain range that had partially shielded it from the initial swarm descent. The picked feeds showed structures still standing, silo towers, hab blocks, a central administratum dome, but everything was wrong. The lines were off, the geometry subtly corrupted. Fungal growths, thick and pulsating, encrusted the walls not as invading flora, but as integrated purposeful architecture. Strange, hybrid banners hung limp in the toxic air, depicting twisted, multi-limbed silhouettes that were neither human nor purely Tyranid. Worse were the inhabitants. The scouts. Enhanced optics had captured grainy images of figures moving in the streets. They walked on two legs, wore tattered remnants of workers' coveralls or enforcers' flak, but their proportions were subtly distorted. Elongated limbs, distended skulls, a telltale, lurching gait. Some were seen performing ritualized, synchronized movements in the central plaza, facing a grotesque icon of fused bone and chitin. Others simply stood, staring blankly at the sky, as if listening to a song only they could hear. The evidence was irrefutable, a diagnosis more insidious than mere consumption. Genestealer cult. The corruption had taken root. The Tyranid vanguard had not just killed here. It had sown its seed, infiltrating the human population, twisting faith and biology into a fifth column that worshipped the coming devourer. The settlement was no longer a refuge. It was a cyst of pure Xenos ideology, a psychic beacon and a biological reservoir for the swarm. To leave it intact was to allow the infection to fester, to potentially spread its taint to any other surviving pockets, or worse, to birth new pure-strain genestealers that could slip off-world. It was a threat that demanded absolute excision. In the command cavern, now cleared of all but his most trusted veterans, Tyberos reviewed the evidence in silence. The hololith displayed the settlement in ghostly green, highlighting heat signatures and the aberrant, rhythmic bio-readings of the cultists. The choice before him was not tactical, it was moral, a razor's edge dividing two kinds of damnation. He could order a purge, a swift, total cleansing with flame and bolt, leaving no living thing standing within the compound's walls. It was the certain path, the efficient one. It guaranteed the cancer's removal, but it would mean the death of every soul within, the corrupted and the potentially innocent alike, for in such a place, who could tell where the infection ended and the victim began? The alternative was a salvage operation, a precision strike to decapitate the cult's leadership, the patriarch and its magus, in the hope that without its psychic linchpins, the thralls might be freed or could be more easily subdued. It was a path of risk and terrible uncertainty. It presumed a line could be drawn, that some humanity might be saved from the Xenos' taint. It was a notion that smelled of hope, and hope was a luxury paid for in blood, often the blood of the hopeful. Tyberos turned from the hololith. His audience was a select group, the Red Terrors, his personal veteran squad. They were the oldest and most merciless of the chapter, their armor a mosaic of repaired damage, their trophy strings so dense they rustled like dry leaves. They stood utterly still, their presence like standing stones in the gloom. He did not ask for a vote, he demanded perspective. The cyst festers, he stated, his voice a low grind. It must be lanced, speak. The leader of the Terrors, a warrior known only as Shar, whose helm was fashioned into the snarling visage of a deep-sea predator, took a half-step forward. His voice, when it came, was the sound of stones grinding in a tide. Salvation is a myth spun for the weak, he rasped, each word clipped and final. The taint is biological, psychic, absolute. It writes itself into the gene code. To hesitate is to allow the vector to spread. There are no innocents in that pit, only the corrupted and the soon-to-be corrupted. Efficiency demands totality. Burn it. Salt the earth. Leave nothing for the hive mind to reclaim. Mercy here is a bullet left in the chamber that will later fire into our backs." The other Terces gave minute nods, a symphony of grim agreement. Their philosophy was the chapter's sharpest edge: identify the threat and remove it in its entirety without pity, without distinction. The universe was a hostile ocean. Sentimentality was a weight that would drag you to the depths. From the entrance to the cavern, a voice spoke, younger, strained with attention the veterans lacked. "There may be a line." All helms turned. Cale stood there, having delivered a final scout report. He had not been dismissed, and the sight of the settlement's picked feeds had rooted him to the spot. He knew he overstepped, that his place was silence, but the images of those shambling figures, some still wearing the tattered clothes of farmers, of families, had ignited a conflict within him that refused to be smothered. "The corruption spreads from the top," he continued, his voice tighter than he wished. "The patriarch, the magus, they are the source. If we cut the head—" "The body still twitches," Shar interrupted, his vox grill emitting a dismissive static crackle. "And in its twitching it infects. You speak of lines, boy. In the dark, with Xeno's filth and human fear screaming in your ears, can you see that line? Will you hesitate when a weeping child, its mind already a puppet of the hive, comes at you with a knife? That hesitation is death. It is failure." Cale felt the weight of the veteran's hollow stares. He saw the cold, relentless logic in Shar's words. It was the logic of the void, of the predator. Yet within him, the ghost of his old humanity, the part not yet fully consumed by the chapter's hungry silence, recoiled. To condemn all, without even an attempt to separate the sick from the damned, it felt like becoming the very mindless devourer they fought. "We are not the swarm," Cale said, the words feeling dangerously naive even as he spoke them. "We are the surgeons. Should we not at least try to excise rather than simply amputate?" A heavy silence followed. Tyberos had been watching the exchange, his expression unreadable behind his helm. He looked from Shar's implacable certainty to Cale's conflicted defiance. The young initiate's argument was not tactical. It was a spark of something else, a flicker of the humanity the chapter worked so hard to extinguish. It was a weakness, and in the outer dark, weakness was a contagion as deadly as any Xeno's taint. Yet, it was also a reminder of what they had once been, of the line they perpetually straddled. Tyberos's decision, when it came, would not be born of debate, but of the ancient, crushing weight of the oath. The ghost of hope in Cale's eyes was a luxury the Carcharodons Astra could not afford. The settlement was a threat. The oath demanded its eradication. The Red Terror's way was the only way that guaranteed the mission's success. But in that moment, as the captain's gaze rested on Cale, the internal conflict was laid bare, not just the initiate's, but the chapter's own. They were humanity's protectors, forged into monsters to fight monsters, and every decision forced them deeper into the darkness within, where the only light was the cold, reflected gleam of their own weapons, and the only salvation offered was the silence of the grave. The order was not spoken aloud. It was a silent command, transmitted through the squad-level voxnet as a single, unadorned glyph, a shark's tooth, dripping. The meaning was unambiguous. The debate was over. The cyst would be lanced, and the method would be cauterization. The Carcharodons moved from the fungal plane towards the corrupted settlement under a bruised, twilight sky. They did not march in formation but flowed like a gray oil spill through the ravines and half-digested rock formations, their movements silent, their forms blurring into the landscape of decay. There was no speech, no final briefing. Each warrior knew his role. They were the instrument of a decision that had been made 10,000 years ago in the moment of their exile. Cale moved with them, his body obeying the ingrained patterns of advance and cover, but his mind was a cage. The image of the shambling figures in tattered work clothes, the possibility of a line, however faint, between victim and vector, screamed against the cold finality of the glyph burning in his retinal display. The settlement's outer wall loomed, a ragged line of plasteel and rockcrete now veined with pulsating, root-like growths. The main gate hung open, twisted on its hinges as if forced from within. No sentries stood watch. The only sound was the low, subaudible hum of the hive mind's song, a psychic drone that made the fillings in Kale's teeth ache. The red terrors took point, melting through the opening like shadows. The rest of the force followed, fanning out into the narrow, refuse-choked streets. The purge began not with a roar, but with a whisper. A figure stumbled from a doorway, a man in the shredded remains of an agri-worker's uniform. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed entirely human. He raised his hands, palms out, his mouth working soundlessly. A bolt round, fired from a rooftop, took him in the chest. The mass-reactive detonation vaporized his torso, painting the fungal wall behind him in a wet red crescent. He had been unarmed. He had been pleading. It made no difference. All distinctions dissolved. The Carcharodons advanced with methodical, pitiless rhythm. They cleared hab blocks not with stun grenades and room-by-room checks, but with frag and flame. Promethium gushed through shattered windows, and the screams that followed were short, choked things, swallowed by the roar of the fire. Figures ran, some clutching crude weapons, others clutching children or each other. They were met with identical, clinical fire. Bolt guns coughed, chainswords whirred and bit. The air thickened with the smells of burning promethium, cooked meat, and the underlying, sweet-rot stench of Tyranid corruption. Kale's squad was tasked with securing a central thoroughfare that led to the Administratum Dome. He moved in a low crouch, his bolt gun sweeping across doorways and alleys. His auto senses highlighted targets. A woman with a distended skull aiming a Laz pistol, a shot and she fell. A group of cultists chanting before a twisted icon, a burst of fire and the chanting stopped. His actions were precise, automatic, a function of training and survival, but with each trigger pull the cage in his mind rattled louder. Then he saw the child. It was a small figure, perhaps 6 or 7 standard years of age, emerging from the smoky mouth of an alley. It wore a simple, smocked dress, now filthy. One side of its face was perfectly normal, tear-streaked and terrified. The other side was subtly wrong, the eye a milky, pupilless orb, the jawline slightly distended, hinting at the chitin beneath the skin. It was a hybrid, its humanity and corruption locked in a visible, pathetic struggle. It saw Kale, a giant in gray ceramite splattered with gore, and froze. Then it did not raise a weapon. It did not hiss or charge. It simply held out its hands, the human ones, in a universal gesture of supplication. A thin, broken wail escaped its lips, a sound of pure animal fear. "Please." The word was a whisper, barely audible over the crackle of flames and distant gunfire, but Kale's enhanced hearing caught it. It pierced the autopilot of combat, the red terror's cold logic, the captain's glyph of finality. It was a human sound from a thing that was not entirely human. His finger rested on the trigger. The targeting reticule in his display, painted over the child's center. Mass pulsed a soft, insistent red. The shot would be easy, it would be certain. It was, by the merciless calculus of the purge, the only correct action. He hesitated. For one eternal, damning second he saw the line. He saw the victim, not the vector. He saw a soul, however twisted, begging for a mercy the universe had forgotten. His gun did not fire. In that second of hesitation, the child's expression shifted. The terror in its normal eye was suddenly joined by a flicker of something else, a cunning, alien intelligence that peered out from behind the human mask. Its pleading hands twitched, and from the sleeve of its smock, a small, chitinous blade, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, snicked into its palm. It was a weapon designed for the soft kill, for the quiet murder in the dark. The hybrid took a half-step forward, not to flee, but to lunge. Instinct, older than reason, took over. Kale's bolt gun roared. The shell struck the child in the outstretched hands, obliterating them in a pink mist before detonating against its chest. The small body was flung backwards into the alley, a broken doll of flesh and exposed, glistening bone that was not entirely human. It lay still, the alien cunning extinguished from its one good eye, leaving only the empty glassiness of death. Kale stood over the tiny corpse, the roar of his weapon echoing in the sudden silence of his own helm. The smell of cordite mixed with the coppery scent of blood. He felt nothing at first, just a vast, hollow coldness. Then the images flooded in, the pleading hands, the milky eye, the hidden blade, the violent eruption of his own shot. They looped behind his eyes, a silent, horrific pict feed that would not stop. His hands, which had been steady, began to tremble against the grip of his bolt gun. A wave of nausea, something his enhanced biology should have suppressed, twisted in his gut. He had killed a child. He had done the necessary thing, the efficient thing, the thing Shar had warned him about. And it had carved a wound in his soul deeper than any Xeno's talon could reach. A heavy presence materialized beside him. Veteran Sergeant Surjax looked down at the small, ruined body, then up at Kale. He made no move to offer comfort, no gesture of understanding. His vox grill emitted a low, static sigh. "Mercy is a luxury," Surjax stated, his voice flat, devoid of condemnation or approval. It was the tone of a man stating the temperature or the phase of a moon. "A luxury paid for with the lives of your brothers and the security of the worlds we are oath-bound to protect. That thing," he nudged the small corpse with the toe of his boot, a chillingly casual gesture, "was a weapon, a slow, insidious poison. You removed it, that is all." He turned his hollow gaze fully upon Kale. "The burden we carry is not glory, it is this. It is the knowledge that to protect the light we must dwell in and become the darkness. We must make choices that would break the spirits of lesser men. We must bear the weight of deeds that would be called atrocities in any other context. This is our curse, to be the monsters who slay monsters, to be the darkness that holds back a greater dark. There is no moral high ground here, initiate. Only the deep, cold trench and the things that must be done to keep the abyss from swallowing everything." He placed a heavy, gauntleted hand on Kale's pauldron, not in camaraderie, but in the manner of a master imparting a final, grim lesson. "The haunting you feel. That is the last echo of the luxury you can no longer afford. Let it fade, feed it to the void. All that remains is the duty, and the duty is merciless." With that, Surjax moved on, rejoining the relentless advance, his gray form disappearing into the smoke. Around Kale, the purge continued. Flames climbed higher. The sporadic crack of bolters was the settlement's dying heartbeat. He looked from the dead child to the necklace of Tyranid teeth on his own chest, then to the carnage unfolding. The street, the line he had tried to see, was gone, erased in blood and fire. Surjax was right. There was no morality here, only the terrible, ambiguous burden of the curse. He had taken another step into the darkness within, and the part of him that had cried out for a line, for mercy, felt smaller, colder, almost drowned. He raised his bolt gun, the tremble in his hands now forced into stillness by an act of sheer, desperate will. He stepped over the small body and followed his sergeant into the smoke, the ghost of a plea still ringing in the silent vault of his mind, a whisper from a humanity that was, with every shot, becoming another trophy on the long, dark chain of his exile. The settlement's death throes were a gift. The roaring flames, the collapsing structures, the final, scattered screams of the cultists, all of it was a symphony of chaos that played perfectly into the Carcharodons' plans. As the last pockets of resistance were crushed under Heel and Prometheum, Captain Tyberos was already moving. The purge had been a brutal, necessary amputation, but it was also the ultimate distraction. While the hive mind's local consciousness reeled from the sudden, violent silencing of its cult, its attention focused on the bright, burning wound of the settlement. The true strike would come from the dark, in a place where the swarm felt most secure. Tyberos gathered his chosen hunters in the shadow of a half-consumed rock face, a kilometer from the settlement's smoldering edge. They were 20 in number, a mix of red terrors and other veterans, their gray armor now matte with soot and dried ichor. Kale was among them, his inclusion a silent command from Surjax. There was no speech, no rousing preamble. Tyberos simply raised a fist, clenched it once, and then pointed into the mouth of a vast, organic tunnel that yawned at the base of the cliffs, a burrow excavated by tunneling bioforms, leading down into the planet's flesh, towards the primary hive ship's subterranean nesting grounds. It was the artery to the heart. They would be the clot. They entered the tunnel and the world changed. The open, ruined sky was replaced by a close, dripping darkness. The walls were not stone but a lattice of hardened bioresin and compacted soil, veined with faintly luminescent fungal growths that cast a sickly green light. The air was hot, thick, and humid, saturated with the pheromonal stink of the swarm, a smell of hot hive chambers, digestive enzymes, and chitinous sweat. The sound of the dying settlement vanished, replaced by the drip of moisture, the skitter of unseen things in adjacent tunnels, and a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their boots, the heartbeat of the hive ship, still distant but growing with every downward step. They did not march, they flowed. Their movements were utterly silent, a testament to centuries of hunting in places where sound was death. They communicated with a complex lexicon of hand signs, each gesture as precise as a spoken word. Halt. Ambush point ahead, spore mine cluster, bypass left. They moved like ghosts through the Xeno's labyrinth, their gray forms melting into the resinous shadows. Their tactics were not those of the Imperial Guard, nor even of other Space Marine chapters. They were feral, otherworldly, born of the void and refined in the lightless places. When they encountered a patrol of termagants scuttling through a junction, they did not engage in a firefight. They let the first ranks pass, then struck from above and behind. Warriors dropped from resinous overhangs, their weight alone crushing bioforms into paste before chainblades finished the work. They killed with their hands, with knives, with brutal, close-quarter snaps of armored limbs, ensuring the deaths were silent. The few shots that were fired were from integrally suppressed stalker-pattern bolt guns, the report's dull thumps swallowed by the soft tunnel walls. They left the mutilated corpses where they fell. But not before performing quick, brutal surgery. They arranged the bodies in grotesque tableaus, limbs torn off and placed in mocking, ritualistic patterns, heads stacked in pyramids, torsos splayed open with Xeno's entrails used to paint crude, shark-like sigils on the tunnel walls. These were not trophies. They were warnings. Psychological warfare against a collective consciousness. A declaration that a more ancient, more ruthless predator now swam in its depths. They set traps with chilling ingenuity. Using scavenged bioacid glands and monomolecular wire from their own kits, they rigged deadfalls and tension triggers inside tunnels. They seeded the path behind them with subsonic mines that would not detonate until a critical mass of bioforms passed over, collapsing tunnels and burying pursuers. They used the hive's own infrastructure against it, sabotaging nutrient conduits so they would rupture and flood passages with corrosive fluids. Their efficiency was inhuman, a seamless blend of transhuman skill and atavistic cunning. They were not soldiers clearing a path. They were hunters seeding a hunting ground with terror. Kale moved in the center of the pack, his senses stretched to their limits. Every drip, every skitter, every shift in the foul air was a potential threat. He watched the veterans work, and the last vestiges of his earlier conflict were burned away in the furnace of this new, more intimate horror. This was warfare stripped to its bones, the ambush, the silent kill, the mutilation to sow fear. It was primal, ugly, and terrifyingly effective. He found himself falling into the rhythm, his own movements becoming quieter, more deliberate. When a lone Genestealer hybrid, its form more alien than human, detached from the shadows of the ceiling above him, he did not fire. He let it drop, met its lunge with his own, and drove his combat knife up through its palate into its brain, holding the twitching body until it stilled, then lowering it soundlessly to the tunnel floor. He felt no revulsion, only a cold, focused assessment of the threat and its elimination. The haunting plea of the child in the settlement was a distant echo, drowned out by the immediate, visceral language of the tunnel. For hours they descended, a phantom malignancy in the hive's veins. The thrumming grew louder, a physical pressure in the air. The bioluminescence intensified, the walls becoming less like compacted earth and more like the internal organs of some vast beast, pulsing with viscous fluids. They encountered no more patrols. The hive mind, perhaps reeling from the carnage they had left in their wake, had pulled its children back, consolidating its defenses around the core. The silence ahead was more ominous than any chittering horde. Tyberos halted the column at the mouth of a vast, cavernous chamber. The tunnel opened onto a gallery overlooking a nightmarish vista. Below, in a cavern the size of a continent, rested the primary hive ship. It was not a vessel, in any conventional sense, but a monstrous, semi-submerged living cathedral of chitin and pulsating flesh, its form melding with the cavern walls and floor. Capillary towers rose from its back, connecting to the ceiling high above, siphoning the last of Sargas's planetary fluids. Around its base, thousands of bioforms twalled in mindless silence, ripper swarms like living mulch, gargantuan bio-titans standing sentinel, and the shimmering, psychic aura of the hive mind's most potent synaptic nodes. The heart of the swarm lay before them, beating its slow, world-killing rhythm. Tyberos surveyed the scene, his gaze calculating. They had used the settlement's chaos, moved with predatory silence and sown terror in the tunnels. The distraction was complete. The hive's attention was fractured. Now they were at the threshold. The feral, otherworldly warfare had brought them to the lair of the devourer itself. He gave a final series of hand signs, assigning positions, marking targets of opportunity among the synaptic creatures. The final assault would not be an ambush. It would be a direct, vicious strike at the brainstem. The sharks had reached the belly of the whale, and their only thought was to tear it apart from the inside. The cavern gallery overlooking the hive ship was not a natural formation. Its smooth, curved walls and geometric support pillars spoke of intelligent design, a prefabricated structure from Sargas's colonization epoch, now swallowed by the hive's organic expansion. While Tyberos and the Red Terrors plotted their final descent, librarian Arcturus strayed from the group, drawn not by tactical necessity but by a psychic whisper, a faint, cold resonance humming in the stone beneath the layers of chitinous overgrowth. He moved to the gallery's rear wall, where the hive's biomass had not yet fully encroached. With a gauntleted hand, he scraped away a curtain of glistening, web-like mycelium. Beneath it, the original rockcrete was exposed, and carved into its surface were glyphs. They were not imperial script. They were not Tyranid biosigns. These marks were angular, stark, and profoundly old, etched with tools of stone or crude metal. They depicted simplified yet unmistakable forms, triangular shapes with serrated edges cutting through waves, circles bisected by vertical lines like jaws agape, patterns of dots that mirrored star charts of the absolute outer void. Arcturus froze, his psychic senses flaring. He knew these symbols. He had seen them every day of his life, inked onto parchment in the chapter's forbidden tomes, etched into the oldest pieces of armor in the Nicor's reliquary, worn as ritual scars by the most venerable of the Red Terrors. They were the primal forms of Carcharodon Astra iconography. The shark, the tooth, the void, but these carvings were not relics of his chapter's exile. Their style, their placement in this deep foundational layer of the colony, spoke of a far greater antiquity. This was pre-imperial work from the age of strife or even earlier, when humanity's lost colonies clung to life in the galactic dark. A colony that, by all imperial records, had no contact with his chapter until this very moment. Arcturus traced a glyph with a finger, feeling the chill of the stone seep through his ceramite. His mind, trained to navigate the treacherous currents of the past, began to assemble a terrifying hypothesis. The parallels were too precise, too fundamental to be coincidence. The iconography was not just similar, it was identical in essence, a shared visual language separated by millennia. What if the Carcharodons Astra were not merely exiles from the Imperium's early years? What if their origins were older, far older, rooted in this forgotten epic of human diaspora? What if their forebears were not space marines cast out, but something else entirely? A cult, a pact, a brotherhood forged in the absolute isolation of the outer dark, who had later been folded or forced into the imperial framework, their true history scrubbed away by the edicts of a forgetful empire. And the nature of that pact, his thoughts turned to the chapter's eerie affinities. Their unnaturally calm warp passages, as if the Empyrean itself recoiled. Their hollow-eyed hunger, so different from the zealous fury of other Adeptus Astartes. Their oath, a chain whose other end was lost in darkness. What if their founders had not just been exiled? What if they had bargained, sworn service to something in the void in exchange for survival, for power, for the ability to become the ultimate predators? The iconography of the shark was not just a symbol, it was a testament, a reminder of a patron or a master that dwelt in the lightless deeps and of the price paid for its patronage. He returned to the group, his psychic presence a storm of quiet turmoil. Tyberos was finalizing the assault vector, pointing towards a pulsating, nerve cluster-like opening on the hive ship's flank. Arcturus interrupted not with words, but by projecting the image of the glyphs directly into the captain's mind, along with the cold, sharp shard of his theory. Tyberos received the psychic packet in stony silence. He turned his helm slightly, the red lenses regarding Arcturus for a long moment. The librarian felt the captain's formidable will, a wall of glacial certainty, push back against the insidious doubt. Archaeology is for dead men, Tyberos' voice grumbled over a private vox link, audible only to Arcturus. We have a living enemy to kill. These scratches are debris, nothing more. Our origins are written in blood and exile, not in the dust of dead colonies. Do not let phantoms fray your focus, librarian. The only past that matters is the one that fuels our next strike. The dismissal was absolute, a commander's refusal to entertain a truth that could destabilize his warriors on the brink of annihilation. Tyberos turned back to the hive ship, his posture radiating finality. The matter was closed, but the unease did not dissipate. It seeped into the gallery's stale air, a new kind of poison. Arcturus stood apart, the carved glyphs burning in his memory. Tyberos could order him to ignore it, but he could not unsee the connection. The theory, once born, took root in the fertile dark of his scholar's mind. If it was true, then everything they were, their curses, their hungers, their silent war, was not an accident of history, but the fulfillment of a forgotten covenant. They were not just exiles, they were inheritors, and their inheritance was a legacy of darkness, older than the Imperium, perhaps older than the idea of humanity itself, echoing up through the millennia to find them here in another dark place, about to perform another act of merciless predation. The haunting sense of their origins, once a vague shadow, now had a shape, and it was carved in stone, mirroring the very teeth they wore into battle. It was a shape that promised no glory, only the chilling possibility that they were, and had always been, exactly what they appeared to be. Not fallen angels, but risen monsters, faithful to the oldest and darkest of vows. The gallery was a tomb of forgotten industry, its air thick with the hum of the hive ship below and the psychic residue of a revelation too terrible to voice. Tyberos's dismissal of the glyphs was a door slammed shut, but the chill from that other, older darkness seeped through the cracks, mingling with the organic heat rising from the cavern. It was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with origin, a suspicion that the abyss they fought was not just before them, but within them, written into their bones long before the first Tyranid spore fell on Sargassa. There was no time for doubt. The only answer to such a chill for the Carcharodons Astra was motion, violence, the red work. Tyberos turned from the wall and its silent accusations, his gaze fixing on the hive ship's flank. His assessment was swift, brutal, and final. There would be no intricate sabotage, no attempt to disable its bioengines. The swarm's consciousness was a distributed network, but every network had a core, a dense knot of synaptic tissue and psychic will where the hive mind's local presence was most concentrated. The cortex. It was buried deep within the living mountain of chitin, protected by layers of armored flesh and legions of guardians. To reach it was to dive into the belly of the beast, to offer oneself to its digestive acids and grinding teeth. "We go through the mouth," Tyberos stated, his voice a low vibration in the cavernous space. He pointed to the pulsating opening on the hive ship's side, a sphincter-like portal that rhythmically dilated, expelling gusts of hot, fetid air and admitting streams of smaller bioforms. It was a nutrient intake, an artery. It led directly into the ship's internal circulatory system, a labyrinth of biomechanical passages that would, inevitably, lead to the heart. It was the most direct path and therefore the most heavily defended. It was also the last thing the hive mind would expect, a direct assault into its gullet. It was the strategy of the shark: close the distance, ignore the thrashing, and bite for the spine. The 20 warriors arrayed before him did not question. They simply began their final preparations. But this was not the ritual of arming nor the harvest of trophies. This was something deeper, more intimate, and far more unsettling. It was the rite of the red edge. One by one, the veterans unsheathed their close combat blades, chainswords, combat knives, the serrated teeth of chainfists. They held the weapons before them. Then, with a deliberate, ritual slowness, each warrior drew his own knife, or in some cases, a single talon from his power fist, across the palm of his opposite gauntlet. The ceramite was too hard to score, so they found the joints, the flexible seals at the wrist. They cut not into flesh, for their transhuman bodies would heal such a minor wound in moments, but they cut deep enough. A thin, dark line of Astartes' blood, rich with engineered life and the legacy of their cursed genome, welled up, beating against the gray armor. They did not wipe it away. Instead, they carefully, reverently, smeared the blood along the cutting edges of their primary weapons. They worked it into the chain links of swords, along the monomolecular edges of knives, into the teeth of claws. The blood, thick and slow to dry, coated the metal and ceramite, turning the edges a dull, rust-black. As they worked, a low, communal hum began, not from their vox grills but from their chests, a vibration that was part chant, part growl, the same dead language phonemes from their earlier rites but now stripped to a raw, guttural core. It was a promise, a binding, a declaration that their next violence would not be merely tactical but sacramental. They were anointing their tools with their own life, committing their very essence to the coming slaughter. The weapon became an extension of their will, their hunger, their curse, sanctified by the ultimate offering, themselves. Kale watched, the cold knot from the settlement purge still lodged in his gut. He saw Serjax draw a fang from his own trophy necklace, using its point to open his palm, then smear the blood along the whirring teeth of his chainsword. He saw the red terrors perform the rite with the chilling automatism of a heartbeat. This was the ultimate commitment, the shedding of all pretense. There was no imperial piety here, no thought of saving souls. This was predation, pure and simple, elevated to a religious act. The blood was the sacrament, the coming violence, the prayer. His doubts, his haunting memories, his terror at the glyph's implication, they did not vanish. They were not conquered by reason or courage. They were simply drowned in the rising tide of a feral resolve that had been seated in him since his induction. Watered by the horrors of Sargassa, and now forced to bloom by this visceral, bloody ritual. The part of him that was still Kale, the initiate who feared the monster within, shrank back, overwhelmed. What surged forward was something older, something that recognized the hum of the dead language, that understood the cold logic of the blood on the blade. It was the shark, sensing the chum in the water. His hands moved without his conscious command. He drew his combat knife, its edge still clean from the tunnels. He looked at his own gauntlet, at the flexible black seal at the wrist. He pressed the point against it and pushed. A sting, sharp and precise. A single dark ruby of blood welled up, holding its surface tension against the artificial skin. He transferred the blade to his other hand, and carefully, his movements mirroring those of the veterans, smeared the blood along the knife's cutting edge. It was a small act, almost insignificant. But as the blood coated the steel, he felt a shift, a final internal click. The weapon was no longer just a tool, it was a part of him. His doubts, his humanity, his fear, they were not gone, but they were now external to this core of purpose. They were baggage to be shed in the heat of the fight. All that remained was the resolve, cold, sharp, and hungry, honed to a razor's edge by his own blood and the echoing growl of his brothers. The rite concluded as silently as it began. The humming ceased. The warriors inspected their red-black blades, then sheathed them or powered up their motors. The chainswords gave low, hungry growls. Lightning claws crackled with renewed energy, the ozone smell cutting through the hive stench. Their eyes, behind their lenses, were no longer merely empty. Now they glinted with a focused, feral light. The unsettling tradition was complete. They had transformed themselves from soldiers into vessels of a single, terminal intent. Tyberos looked them over, his own massive claws dark with the same ritual. Offering, he gave a single, slow nod. No words were needed. The pact was made. The offering given. The only thing left was the consummation. As one, the gray phantoms moved from the gallery's edge, flowing down a natural rock ramp towards the vast, living ship below. They headed straight for the pulsating maw, a line of silent, blood-anointed killers walking openly into the belly of the devourer. The heart of the swarm awaited, and they came not as saviors, not as liberators, but as a sharper, darker kind of hunger, ready to tear the world killer apart from the inside out. The pulsating maw did not swallow them, it inhaled them. One moment they were on the cavern floor, the next they were inside a living, breathing hell. The transition was absolute. The air became a thick, viscous soup of pheromones, hot moisture, and the deafening, rhythmic throb of the hive ship's internal organs. The walls were not walls, but pulsating membranes of slick purple flesh, ribbed with cartilage and threaded with glowing green nerve strands that pulsed in time with the deep, subsonic heartbeat. The floor was a spongy, yielding surface that sucked at their boots with each step. The passage sloped downward, a slick, organic esophagus leading into the gut of the beast. They had taken a dozen steps when the hive mind's will, focused and furious, found them. The walls convulsed. From fleshy sphincters overhead and slits in the floor, the swarm's most dedicated guardians poured forth. These were not the gaunts and warriors of the open field. These were the synapse creatures, the elite bioforms honed for the defense of the core. Zoanthropes floated into the passage, their bulbous heads crackling with warp energy that made the air sizzle and the Carcharodons' teeth ache. Venomthropes exuded clouds of choking, hallucinogenic spores that turned the already thick air into a blinding, psychic fog. And leading them, emerging from a larger portal ahead with a psychic shriek that felt like needles driven into the mind, was the Neurathrope. It was a monstrous evolution of the Zoanthrope, a towering, floating abomination of concentrated hive will. Its body was a distended sack of brain matter, veined with bioluminescence, trailing writhing tentacles tipped with bone blades. Its single, massive eye burned with a cold, alien intelligence that saw not individuals, but threats to the collective self. It was the guardian of the cortex, a psychic fortress made flesh, and its presence was a weight that pressed down on the soul. Tyberos did not break stride. He raised his lightning claws, the blood-anointed talons crackling with a blue-white fury that seemed to bite into the psychic fog. His intent was a beacon, a challenge. The Neurathrope answered, a lance of pure psychic force, visible as a distortion in the air like heat haze over a desert, speared towards him. Tyberos crossed his claws before him. The impact was not a sound, but a concussive thump of displaced air that knocked two nearby battle brothers from their feet. Energy cascaded over his Terminator armor, scorching the gray ceramic, but he held, his boots grinding into the spongy floor. The Neurathrope shrieked again, a sound of frustration and alien rage. Then the passage dissolved into a blur of violence. Tyberos charged the floating horror, a gray avalanche against a psychic tide. The Neurathrope retreated, lashing out with psychic blasts and whipping tentacles. Each time Tyberos closed the distance, the creature would blink backwards through the air with unnatural speed, forcing him to batter through intervening bioforms. He became a whirlwind of crackling death, his claws shearing through zoanthropes that drifted too close, their psychic shields popping like bubbles before the physical and spiritual fury of his assault. But the Neurathrope was cunning, using its lesser kin as living shields, harrying him with mental assaults that sought to fray his formidable will. While their captain dueled, the synaptic titan, the rest of the strike team was engulfed. The passage, wide as a city street, became a charnel house. Zoanthropes unleashed bolts of warp lightning that cooked armor from the inside. Venomthropes, spore clouds induced waking nightmares, visions of the void swallowing them, of their own brothers turning on them with hollow eyes. The Carcharodons fought not as a line, but as a pack of individual killers, each warrior a gray island in a sea of chitin and psychic fury. Kale found himself back-to-back with a veteran whose name he did not know, their world reduced to the few meters of hell they could see through the spore fog. A zoanthrope drifted towards them, its brain mass glowing. Kale fired his bolt gun, but the mass-reactive shells detonated harmlessly against a shimmering psychic barrier inches from its flesh. The veteran grunted, hefting a meltagun. The weapon coughed a stream of star-hot plasma that punched through the barrier and vaporized half the creature in a spray of steaming offal. The psychic backlash from its death was a wave of nausea and psychic static. Something scuttled from the fog, a venomthrope, its spore sacs pulsing. Kale's world dissolved. The fleshy walls became the cold, silent halls of the Nicor, but the faces of his brothers were skulls, and the only sound was the child from the settlement, whispering pleas over and over. He felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his bolt gun, the barrel swinging towards the veteran beside him. With a roar that tore from his own throat, he wrenched his aim away, firing into the ceiling. The veteran, similarly afflicted, was staggering, his chainsword raised against a phantom only he could see. The venomthrope loomed closer, its spores a tangible, mind-killing mist. The red thirst, that engineered curse lurking in the blood of every Adeptus Astartes, had always been a quiet, distant pulse in Kale's veins, a theoretical part of his augmentation. Now, drowning in psychic poison and the overwhelming press of the swarm, it awoke. It did not come as a rage, but as a clarity. A singular, burning imperative that burned away the hallucinations, the doubt, the fear, the haunting whispers. It was not a loss of control, but a surrender to a deeper, more fundamental control. The need to fight, to kill, to feed. The world snapped back into focus, but it was a different world. The colors were sharper, the sounds more distinct, the whine of chain blades, the wet tear of flesh, the crackle of Tyberos's claws. The spore fog was still there, but it no longer held terrors, it was just an obstacle. The venom throat before him was not a monster but a target, a thing to be removed. He did not fire his bolt gun. He charged. The distance closed in a heartbeat. The venom throat reared back, but Kale was already inside its reach. He drove his combat knife, the edge still stained with his own ritual blood, into the soft, pulsing sac of its primary spore gland. He twisted, and a geyser of acidic, hallucinogenic fluid erupted, sizzling against his armor. The creature thrashed, but he held on, using his weight to bear it to the spongy floor. He saw not a xenos, but a throat. He abandoned the knife, buried to the hilt, and his gauntleted hands found the creature's neck, a cord of gristle and chitin. He did not strangle. He tore. With a wet, ripping sound that was immensely satisfying, he separated its head from its body, silencing its psychic emissions. He rose, the head in one hand, ichor dripping from his fingers, and cast it aside. There was no triumph, only a cold, humming void where his thoughts had been. He retrieved his knife, his movements economical, precise. He looked for the next target. The veteran beside him had shaken off his own visions, and they exchanged a glance. No nod of thanks, no sign of camaraderie. Just the shared, hollow understanding of predators who have survived an ambush. Kale lost himself. Not to madness, but to the function. The red thirst was the engine, and he was the weapon. He moved through the fray, a specter of efficient butchery. He used his bolt gun in short, controlled bursts, aiming for the joints of warriors, the eye clusters of gaunts. When they closed, he used his knife, his fists, his armored bulk. He fought with a chilling, detached ferocity. The memories of the settlement, the weight of the oath, the mystery of the glyphs, they were gone, burned as fuel for the violence. He was not Kale the conflicted initiate. He was a Carcharodon. A tooth in the gray jaw. His world was the next target, the next kill, the next step towards the beating heart of the enemy. The monstrous aspect of his existence was no longer something to be feared or examined. It was the tool he wielded, the air he breathed, the only truth in a universe of flesh and fury. Around him, the battle was a tapestry of similar, isolated brutalities. Brothers fell, dragged down by weight of numbers or disintegrated by psychic fire. Their deaths were met not with cries of anguish, but with a redoubling of effort from those nearby, a closing of the ranks. Tyberos and the Neurothrope were a storm of their own, a duel of primal force against alien intellect that carved a path of devastation deeper into the hive ship's core. The blur of violence had a direction, forward, always forward, into the heat and the stench and the deafening pulse, towards the source of it all. Kale fought, emptied of everything but the thirst and the function, a living illustration of the violent, monstrous truth at the heart of the Carcharodons Astra. They were not heroes in the dark. They were the dark itself, given teeth and an endless, hungry will. The Neurothrope's death was not a collapse but an unraveling. One moment it was a towering pillar of psychic malice, its tentacles lashing, its mind hurling bolts of soul-shattering force. The next, Tyberos's lightning claws found their mark. He had feigned a stumble, baiting the creature into a final, overcommitted lunge. As the bone-bladed tentacles stabbed towards his chest, he pivoted with a speed that belied his Terminator bulk, the crackling talons of his right fist sweeping up in a savage arc. They sheared through the base of the creature's distended brain sac, slicing through nerve cord and chitinous plating with a sound like a lightning strike hitting water. There was no scream, only a silent, psychic detonation. The Neurothrope's massive eye went dark, its bioluminescence guttering out like a drowned star. Its body did not fall. It disintegrated, dissolving into a cloud of gray, psychic ash and steaming organic slurry that rained down upon the spongy passage floor. The immense pressure of its will, a constant, crushing weight on the mind, vanished so abruptly it left a ringing vacuum in the air. Around them the swarm faltered. The lesser bioforms, the zoanthropes, the venomthropes, the warriors that had been pressing the attack with mindless ferocity, stumbled as one. Their movements became jerky, uncoordinated. The zoanthropes' warp bolts fizzled into harmless static. The venomthropes' spore sacs deflated, their toxic mists dissipating. The hive mind's local consciousness, its guiding intelligence for this sector of the ship, had been decapitated. The synaptic network was severed, leaving only animal instinct and biological programming. The tide of chitin and claws did not retreat, but it became a mindless thrashing, dangerous but directionless. Victory. But the silence that followed the psychic blast was not one of relief. It was the silence of a butcher's yard after the killing blow. Tyberos stood amidst the dissolving remains of his foe, his massive form wreathed in tendrils of steam and psychic residue. His lightning claws were still active, casting a flickering blue-white light over the carnage. Then, with a sudden, violent shudder that ran through his entire frame, he deactivated them. The crackling energy died, and his arms fell to his sides, heavy as stone. He took a single, staggering step forward, and a gout of dark, viscous fluid, not Tyranid ichor, but the deep crimson of Astartes' blood, erupted from the joint between his chest plate and his abdomen, splattering across the organic floor. During the duel, a bone-bladed tentacle in its final, dying spasm had found a gap. It had punched through the reinforced ceramite, piercing deep into his secondary heart and shredding a network of augmetic organs. He had ignored it, the combat stimulants and his own indomitable will overriding the damage. Now, with the immediate threat gone, the wound announced itself with terminal authority. Around him, the strike team assessed the cost. Of the 20 who had entered the pulsating maw, fewer than 10 still stood. The others lay where they had fallen, their gray armor cracked open by psychic fire, dissolved by bioacids, or torn apart by talons. Some were merely still, their lifeblood seeping into the hive ship's flesh. Others were unrecognizable, reduced to components scattered amidst the Xenos dead. The passage was a charnel mosaic of gray ceramite and purple chitin, of imperial blood and alien ichor, all churned together into a foul paste. There were no cries for help, no last words. The Carcharodons did not mourn in the moment, they acted. Those who could still move began the grim work of retrieval. They did not attempt to recover the obliterated. For those whose bodies remained largely intact, they worked with brutal efficiency. They severed mangled limbs that would snag used combat knives to cut away armor fused to flesh by bioplasma, and hoisted the corpses onto their shoulders in firemen's carries. There was no gentleness, only the pragmatic need to deny the hive ship the biomass of their fallen brothers. Tyberos, leaning heavily on the shoulder of a red terror, was half carried, half dragged, a trail of his blood marking their retreat. The journey back through the hive ship's interior was a nightmare. In reverse, the mindless bioforms still twitched and snapped, but without coordination they were obstacles, not a wall. The Carcharodons blasted and hacked their way through, their movements now fueled by a desperate, exhausted urgency. The ritual blood on their blades was mingled with fresh gore. The feral resolve that had carried them in was now the grim stubbornness that carried them out. Kale, his own armor scorched and dented, helped bear the weight of a brother whose legs ended at the knees. The red thirst had receded, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. His own from a split lip or his brother's he could not tell. They emerged from the pulsating maw into the vast cavern, the hive ship still throbbing behind them, but its rhythm seemed slower, confused. They did not stop. They retraced their path through the tunnels, past their own macabre warnings and the traps they had set, now ignoring the skittering sounds in the dark. Climb back to the gallery, then up through the rock face to the surface, was an agony of weight and dwindling strength. When they finally staggered into the fading, toxic daylight, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The settlement was a smoldering ruin in the distance, silent now. Their waiting thunderhawks, hidden in a canyon, took them up, the roar of the engines a welcome, mechanical sound after the organic horror below. Back aboard the Nicor, drifting once more in the cold silence of the void, the final price was tallied. In one of the ship's many austere chambers, a space used for storage and for this sole, somber purpose, the fallen were laid out in rows upon the bare deck. Their armor, what remained of it, was not polished for display. It was cracked, blackened, and stained. The chapter's tech marines moved among them, not to repair, but to reclaim, unlocking the gene-seed progenoids from the corpses' necks with ritual solemnity, securing the chapter's future from the flesh of its past. Then came the rites. There was no chaplain delivering sermons, no listing of heroic deeds, no incense or choirs. The Carcharodons gathered, those who could stand, forming a silent ring around their dead. Captain Tyberos was not present. He was in the apothecarian, his life hanging in the balance between biology and augmetic surgery. Veteran Sergeant Serjax led the observance. They stood in silence for precisely 100 heartbeats, counted by the slow, metronomic thump of a single drum made from the stretched hide of a void whale. The sound was deep, lonely, and final. At the drum's last beat, teams of armored serfs, their faces masked and their movements robotic, stepped forward. They lifted the bodies, carried them to a wide, circular airlock set in the chamber's far wall. There were no coffins, no shrouds. The fallen were placed directly upon the cold metal of the airlock deck, still in their ravaged armor, still clutching their weapons if they could be pried from. Their dead hands, one by one the inner hatch sealed. A light above the door blinked from red to green. A deep, vibrating hum filled the chamber as the outer door irised open, and then silence. The bodies were ejected, cast into the endless, star-studded black. There was no ceremony, no spoken word of farewell. They were given back to the void from which they came, from which the chapter drew its identity and its curse. Their names would be added to the silent rolls in the ship's archives, another entry in a list of the forgotten. Their sacrifice purchased the continuance of the hunt, the fulfillment of the oath. That was their memorial. That was their glory. Kale watched from the ring, the small gaunt's tooth cold against his chest plate. He watched the empty airlock cycle again and again until the deck was bare. The cost was not just in numbers. It was in the hollow spaces left in the squads, in the silent absence of brothers who had moved and fought beside him. It was in the grievous wounding of their captain, a living embodiment of their purpose, now broken. It was in the cold, functional finality of the ejection into the void. No pyre, no tomb, just nothing. This was the cursed life. Victory was measured not in parades or reclaimed ground, but in the grim calculus of survival and duty fulfilled. The swarm on Sargassa was broken, its heart stabbed. The agri-world was saved, though it would be a scarred, toxic husk for centuries. The oath was upheld. But the price was carried in the silent decks of the Nicor, in the empty bunks, and in the eyes of the survivors, which seemed, if possible, even more hollow and hungry than before. They had won. And as the last of the fallen vanished into the infinite dark, Kale understood that for the Carcharodons Astra, victory was just another kind of silence, another weight to be carried on their endless patrol through the outer dark. The void reclaimed them. The Nicor hung once more in the silent, starless deep between. The spiral arms, a leviathan, returned to its natural state. The lumens on the bridge were dialed to their lowest setting, casting the chamber in the perpetual blood-watch gloom that felt more like home than any sunlit world ever could. The ship bore new scars, micropittings from spore clouds, superficial burns from bioplasma backwash, a psychic resonance in its adamantium bones that made the machine spirit twitch in its sleep. But it was whole. It drifted, engines at a murmur, a predator digesting its meal. In the apothecarian, a chamber of cold steel and the sharp, clean scents of antiseptic and coagulants, Cale stood vigil. Captain Tyberos lay upon a slab-like medici berth, a mountain of scarred flesh and blackened ceramite held together by will, augmetics, and the grim expertise of the chapter's apothecaries. The Terminator armor had been peeled away, revealing a ruin of a body. The wound in his abdomen was a sealed crater of synth flesh and grafted organics, but the damage had gone deeper, scouring his enhanced biology to its limits. He was awake, his eyes chips of flint in a face that looked like weathered granite fixed on the low ceiling. He did not speak of the neurothrope or the hive ship's cortex or the tactics of the final strike. When his voice finally came, it was a dry rasp, the sound of stone grinding against stone, stripped of its commanding power and reduced to raw truth. "You have seen the teeth of the galaxy, Cale," Tyberos said, not looking at him. "You have felt them bite. Now you must understand the jaw that holds them." Cale remained silent, his own body aching with half-healed wounds, the ghost of the red thirst a dull echo in his veins. The small tooth on his chest felt heavier than the armor he wore. "Ours is a cursed burden," Tyberos continued, the words leaving him like a slow exhalation of poison. "We are the Imperium's hidden teeth, necessary, unseen, unwelcome." He shifted slightly, a movement that cost him visible pain. "Lords of Terra sleep behind walls of faith and fire. They dream of glorious legions and holy wars. They do not dream of us, they cannot. For us to be known, to be acknowledged, would be to admit that the darkness they fear is so vast, so hungry, that it requires monsters like us to hold it at bay." He turned his head, the movement slow and precise, and his flinty eyes found Cale's. There was no apology in them, no regret, only a vast, weary certainty. "We are the proof of the abyss. Our existence is a confession that the light has limits, that the Emperor's grace does not reach everywhere. So we are exiled even in service. We answer the screams from the dark, we bleed in the forgotten places, we break horrors so that others may never know their shape. And when the work is done, we fade back into the silence. No gratitude, no remembrance. Only the next scream from the next dying world in the next stretch of endless night." Cale felt the truth of it settle into his bones, colder than the void outside. It was the logic of the settlement purge, of the bloody rites of the bodies cast into the dark without ceremony. It was not cruelty, it was function. They were a tool, a brutal specific instrument, and tools were not thanked, they were used, then sheathed until needed again. The horror of Sargassa, the chittering swarms, the corrupted child, the living hell of the hive ship, was not an aberration. It was the standard condition of their duty. The cursed burden was to bear that horror, to immerse oneself in it completely, and to never speak of it, to never expect a reprieve from it. "I understand, my captain," Cale said, his own voice quiet in the sterile stillness. "The oath is the chain, the hunt is the purpose, there is nothing else." It was not a joyful acceptance. It was a surrender, the final closing of a door. He accepted his place not as a hero, but as a component of the machine, a tooth in the hidden jaw. The conflict that had raged within him since the arming chambers, the fear of the monster, the longing for a line, a glimmer of something that was not hunger or silence, was extinguished. It had been burned away in the hive ship's psychic fires, drowned in the blood of the purge, and now laid to rest by the captain's raw, unvarnished truth. There was no room for it. To carry it would be a weight that would drag him down in the deep, dark trenches where they swam. Tyberos gave a slow, shallow nod, a gesture of grim satisfaction. "Good. The burden is heavy. But it is ours to carry. It is the price of being the shield that is also a blade." He looked back to the ceiling, his energy spent. The audience was over. Cale turned and left the apothecarian, the hiss of the door sealing behind him sounding like a tomb closing. He walked the familiar, dim corridors of the Nicor, his footsteps echoing in the vast, quiet spaces. He passed battle brothers performing their silent maintenance, their hands moving over weapons and armor with ritual care. Their eyes met his, and in the hollow depths he saw his own reflection. There was no camaraderie in the human sense, only the shared, unspoken knowledge of the burden. They were all teeth in the same jaw. He arrived at his assigned cell, a spare, unadorned space with a bunk, a weapon rack, and a small, sealed viewport. He stood before the port, gazing out at the absolute black. Sargassa was now just a set of coordinates in the ship's log, a bloody entry in a chronicle no one would read. But its horrors remained. They were not memories to haunt him. They were lessons etched into his nervous system, data points in the grim science of their existence. The pleading child, the feral resolve in the hive ship, the captain's wounded truth, they were all part of the same tapestry, woven from the dark thread of their curse. The Nicor drifted on. Its course was not set for a friendly port, for resupply or accolades. It was moving towards the next gravitational pull of violence, the next silent scream. In the astropathic choir, it was a hunter, forever turning its blind, sensor-studded face towards the ripples of conflict in the galactic deep. Cale finally understood the ominous reflection of their role. They were not just protectors, they were predators, and the galaxy was an infinite ocean, forever spawning new horrors. Their hunt was eternal. They would drift from shadow to shadow, from one bleeding edge of the Imperium to the next, answering the calls too terrible for others to hear, fighting battles too dark to be remembered. They were the necessary evil, the blasphemous prayer, the silence after the scream. They were the Carcharodons Astra, and in the endless, hungry dark between the stars, their teeth would never dull, and their burden would never lighten. They were forever hunters, and the void was their only home.